Awesome to welcome Vincent Minjares to the Basketball Podcast. Vince is the program manager of the Sports and Society program of the Aspen Institute with responsibility for driving project plays, school sport, and coaching portfolios. Vince has extensive international research and professional experience in youth sports coaching, coach development, and long-term athlete development. His current work at the Institute focuses on improving youth experiences in sport, including prioritizing athlete health and safety, bolstering coach training, strengthening national coaching policy, and reimagining models of school sports. Vince holds a PhD in coaching and pedagogy from AUT University, Auckland, New Zealand, an MA in education from the University of California, Berkeley, within the Cultural Studies of Sport and Education program, and a BA in economics from Claremont McKenna College. His research interests emphasize sports coaching, education, and human development, with published research in the areas of youth sports reform. Before you listen to this podcast, I want you to come up with an answer to each of these questions to stimulate your thinking about some of the things we're going to talk about. Question number one: from what I know, most coaches would benefit from training in this one topic. Number two: what is one kind of support that would improve your experience coaching? Number three: what is one resource that you would prioritize to better support your coaching? And number four: what is one thing you would change about the way coach education happens in your country? Please take some time, think about those questions, answer them, and then listen to the podcast. We're all in this together to try and improve coaching and the experience for any athlete that plays our sport. And we're all going to do our best to be able to help grow the game. Vince, welcome to the Basketball Podcast.
Hey, Chris, nice to be here.
Least nobody think with your background that I just shared with everyone, they're going, okay, this is just an education guy and all that stuff, but you're a basketball guy. So maybe just shape that background for us a little bit, because you've been involved in all levels of basketball.
Yeah, man. I grew up in Southern California, longtime Laker fan, played suburban kid, hoop in the backyard. I played high school basketball at Damien High School, which has become a really strong high school. That wasn't always the case when I played. A Division III basketball player at Claremont McKenna College. I have coached really at every level. I was a junior college assistant coach for some time, coached at Colony High School for a bit here in Ontario, California. Spent a lot of time coaching internationally. So I lived in New Zealand for 8 years and coached at the sort of local level, coached at the representative level, which is a different structure in New Zealand, coached some junior national teams in New Zealand, and have really been working, in basketball my whole life. This is my first job not really focused on basketball in a long time. So yeah, spent also some time in college basketball, more in a student athlete support role at Cal Berkeley. Spent about 5 years working with athletes there.
It's awesome. And I've got a chance to know you. I've followed your work, just tremendous stuff. And coaches, like, we asked you some of those questions to get you prepared and thinking about what we're going to talk about. And not only do we need to have this conversation, we need you to share this conversation and engage with this conversation. So please do that as we share this on social media. Please feel free to hit us back with questions, comments, anything like that, because I know what Vince is trying to do is just simply grow the quality of coaching. And you shared something with me. This is less about good coaching right now and more about what good coaching development is. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think that for those of us who spend a lot of time really in the world of coaching and trying to improve coaching, there's a lot of discussion and debate around what is a good coach. And I do think it's a really important conversation to have, thinking about relationship building and X's and O's and tactics and culture. And I think those things are very important and will always be important. But I think the conversation we're wanting to have is almost a step back from that, which is, how do we actually do good coach development, right? As a sort of systematically and at scale in a large place like California, or certainly the whole country. And I think that this conversation shifts the tone, right? It's more about how, certainly, what's the responsibility of coaches themselves to their own learning and development, But more importantly, how do the organizations, the institutions, the governing bodies, and the school districts and so forth really come together to create an environment where coaches can actually be systematically grown in ways that align with what good coaching is? And I think that's a shift in conversation for the US in many ways, but it is increasingly a conversation internationally that I've come to appreciate and think needs to be happening a little bit more, certainly here.
We'll touch on this briefly. There is a big difference between how it's approached in the US versus how it's approached in other countries in the world. Particularly, there's some very good countries that are doing really good work in terms of coach
Yeah,
development, coach evaluation, all that different stuff. So maybe
sure.
just highlight some of the differences that exist around the world.
I'll just give you a really good one in New Zealand. So I worked for quite some time at Harvard Basketball, which is a national it's a regional body who provides coach development and sport development support to, let's say, about 300,000 people who live north of Auckland. This entity, number one, I was paid full time to be a coach development officer. Like, let's just start there. Like, full time position, working with coaches, both at the local club we offered, but in the surrounding community, right? And in close contact with the national body. So that's like number one. Is there an infrastructure of paid professionals whose job it is to develop coaches? Number two, we, like any club there, needed to find coaches. And it's the same challenge everywhere around the world. The difference at that club was that down the street, there was a university, AUT University, which has a coach's bachelor's degree. And students in that degree were required to do placement hours in local organizations. So we would get young hoopers. Some of them were former players, some of them were just fans, and they would come and they would basically get academic credit for coaching in our club. We didn't have to pay them. We just had to sign the paperwork and support their learning. In some cases, they ended up coming back the next year and doing a full year placement with us. And I think that you think about the connection. So there you're thinking about the connection to university and coaching as a pathway, certainly academically and career-wise. Most universities in New Zealand have a coaching degree option at the bachelor's level. And I moved to New Zealand because I wanted to do my PhD in coaching, which I felt was something was going to be hard to do in the US. Those are just two options, right? Those in terms of thinking about the infrastructure, right? I think the other part of it is, of course, having a national agency. In the case of New Zealand, it's Sport New Zealand, whose job it is to provide guidance around what good coach development looks like, to invest in coach developers as a systematic role, and to really have a clear philosophy around the kind of coaching that they believed was necessary at the grassroots and high performance levels.
To add to this, when I did the
Yeah.
National Coaching Certification Program in Canada, that's four different levels. And in each level, there is a practical evaluation by whether it's a peer or a
Mhm.
coaching expert that would evaluate me. In each level, it got more extensive in terms of that, but there was somebody there actually evaluating me. To my knowledge, this does not exist at all in America, in basketball particularly, but does it exist in some other sports in America?
Yeah, there's definitely like quite extensive certification structures in the US. It just hit and miss and differs, right? So there are NGBs, national governing bodies. For example, the US Soccer Federation has an extremely robust licensing structure that progresses over time and levels, that includes a combination of courses and in-person workshops, some evaluation, some tailored assignment work. I think there's definitely there. Then there's also large national bodies who are not necessarily governing bodies, but are just organizations who have certainly strong structures. I'll give you an example is First Tee, which I'm not sure if folks know what First Tee is, but First Tee is a youth golf program. And they have a four-tier certification structure. The national office does observations of coaches and provides support for observation of coaches. And in order to progress up to different levels, you have to complete one to make it into the next. And I think these are obviously like would be ideal and amazing in any structure, but there's obviously challenges. You have to have the infrastructure to develop, to implement them. You need to have the know-how around coaching and your community to make them a reality. But it's the kind of thing that I think a strong coaching nation has, which is a sort of degree of standards for the kinds of coaches that we want, and acts as a bit of a quality control mechanism to make sure that the folks who are progressing through the system have met some benchmarks.
I didn't ask this of the coaches in advance, but let me ask something to the coaches real quick as you're listening.
Yeah.
Have you ever been evaluated? in your coaching. Just take a second, coach. Have you ever been evaluated in your coaching? Now, Vince, tell us, based on the studies that you sent me, what does the numbers say in terms of the number of coaches that have been evaluated?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating, right? That half of all coaches have never been evaluated. This is according to some of the
I
data.
actually thought that was high. I would have thought it would have been lower, but I get that most colleges have some type of process to evaluate whether it's actually real. I don't never felt it was actually real, but
Yeah.
there was a mechanism in place.
In this case, so I think folks, if you haven't, I would encourage folks to take a look at the National Coach Survey, which was a survey that Ohio State University researchers administered. We worked with them and Nike and Susan Krein Exchange to have this thing developed. But I think it's a really interesting insight of like most coaching, we intuitively know that a lot of coaching, you're on an island. And one of the issues that we have with being on an island by yourself and not having support or being evaluated is that you're not getting feedback, you're not getting guidance, you're not getting insight. And so you're left to your own devices. In this case, it's really a question of like how many, not just how many coaches have been evaluated, but even have you been evaluated more than once? And I think certainly in schools, it can be hard because athletic director is like a lot of time, but it doesn't always mean that the athletic director has to evaluate you. I mean, peer evaluations and peer observations are still a really valuable pathway to improving it. The question is, do we want to be evaluated? Do we want for people to look at our coaching and share what they see with us? That's something that all coaches have to grapple with, because I'll give you another one. How many coaches have filmed themselves coaching? Right? And not filmed the play on the court, but filmed them as their sideline behavior, the way in which their body language happens, the way in which they engage with players or officials. I think a lot of coaches would be in for a rude awakening if they actually film themselves on the sideline and their mannerisms and actually honestly took a stock take of, is this how I should be operating as a coach?
It's hard to watch sometimes. I'm young. That's how basketball immersion started. Just literally, I filmed a practice for an evaluation. I said, wait a minute, this is actually going to be beneficial to share.
Yeah.
And it became part of that kind of raw experience to be able to share it. Nearly half of all coaches report that they've been evaluated. That's just, to me, again, this is something that if you're a coach who obviously wants to improve, and I think generally most coaches want to improve. So they go into it with the right reasons. How do we make sure that this process doesn't feel confrontational?
Yeah.
Because that's the main thing to get it beyond that. Somebody's not like evaluation doesn't mean criticizing. It means that we're trying to improve it in some way, whether it's a makeover, add to, or subtraction from. So talk to us about that process of getting beyond some of those barriers.
I think there's a couple things. I think one would be evaluation might be a strong word. I think we might prefer to use the word observation.
I called it peer analysis.
Sure. I think we can use a less like high stakes term. And I do think that observation doesn't need, I think it needs to be set up in the beginning. If we want people to embrace it, we need to set it up in the beginning as a sort of non-confrontational, not high, like low stakes observation where the goal is learning and improvement. Much like what we would tell our teams if we were filming them and having that conversation, right? And so I think if you want coaches to buy into the process, I think that's an important one. I think the second one is really a question of to what extent is the observation connected to a sort of established coaching approach, style, philosophy, right? And so is that your philosophy? So I know there's a strong argument for coaches actually designing the observational instrument themselves and giving it to someone and having them review it. Another would be more of, if I'm in a club or I'm in a school, do we have a coaching charter or a coaching philosophy that we can use as the basis for observation so that we can then, and have we articulated that and gone through that with our club in a way that folks endorse going into the season or going into the start of their role with that club that then aligns to the observational instrument that you create. And I think that the more that these things are transparent, why are we doing this? What are we looking at and why? And then how are we using the information? Let's be clear before how we might use that, what the goals would be of that. I think we are in a dearth, honestly, and probably too academic of a term, but I think we're in a real void of coaches having their own development plans. So a coach should have a development plan. A coach should have a pathway to growth in the areas of their coaching approach. That includes the goals that they set for the program, the way they shape the environment, the way they prepare for competition, and obviously practice design, but also how they resolve conflict and how they learn. And I think these processes need to be part of a broader plan. I think a really good program does this for all coaches systematically. It might feel like a pipe dream, but I think that it's something we really need to be progressing towards if we want our coaching programs to grow.
Let me get your thoughts on this. Like the majority of college programs that I've worked with, I
Sure.
usually go in for 2 days or so, and I'm involved in evaluating, helping them improve their practices is primarily the main reason. As the season goes on, I would say the majority of my role always comes back to tactics. And that's a real challenge, isn't it? And this
Yeah.
whole piece is that as a focus, coaches probably have an overemphasis, is that fair to say, on tactical and technique development as a coach. Not that's not important, but is it an overemphasis?
Yeah, I think we probably have. I totally understand it. Having been in the heat of battle, like many coaches, as you're progressing through your season, you're noticing trends. We got to do this differently. We got to do a better job pressuring the ball, or we got to do a better job of getting good open catch and shoot threes, or whatever it may be. And I think those are honest, genuine questions that will always be important. I think the question of overemphasis is an interesting one because I'm actually one of those people who would is more thinking about how do we help coaches see the technical tactical like questions and challenges not as exclusively technical tactical questions, right? So if you think something like shot selection, which I've spent a lot of time studying and I know you spent a lot of time working on, is shot selection purely a technical tactical problem, or is shot selection a social, cultural, team climate problem that requires a different set of skills for coaches to really work on? How am I communicating with my team around this tactical problem? And am I viewing this as simply a data dissemination piece, or am I viewing this as actually I'm not connecting with my lead guards in the way that I need to? And I think that it's more of a question of how can we help coaches see how the challenges that we're seeing on the court are ultimately fundamentally connected always to some interpersonal, psychological, social, and emotional dynamics. And I actually think there's a really good study, and I'll share it with you afterwards, about social and emotional learning in the course of a season is driven by team conflicts on the court primarily, right? And I think that one of the things that we see is these conflicts, right? Whether it be a decision-making conflict, whether it be a patterns in play conflict, always when you pull back, reveal something bigger around how the kids are handling and coping with things. And I think coaches need to be ready to figure out, is this simply a technical tactical piece, or is this actually require me to spend some time with a person or with a group of people and really talk and connect with where they are right now as young people? And I think that should be, it's less about stop doing technical tactical and figure out ways to connect these things together.
I love how you frame that. That's excellent to be able to think. Now, I did ask some of the coaches some questions in advance before you came on, and
Sure.
I want to get your thoughts on some of those questions that we asked the coaches, and especially focused around the coach development piece. From what I know, most coaches would benefit from training in this topic. What does the research say? And what does Vince say?
Look, I think that the biggest growth area that we're seeing right now, and I think the area that we would be promoting all coaches is really the mental health of athletes. And I think that I personally see, so performance anxiety is an interesting sort of entry point into conversations around mental health and performance. And I think that for coaches who are looking for an entry point or a place to really understand how to really create a culture where my players feel like they're supported, they're cared for, they're looked after, but also a culture of really playing to your personal best. I think that really tapping into and understanding the way that young people engage in self-talk, the way that young people make sense of mistakes, the way that young people are worried about outcomes or thinking about what success is in this context. Or I think we really have a lot of coaches who need to get better at their ability to understand the psychology of players. And I think that the first place to start is really this intersection of the anxiety, the worry that could be something quite big, but also that, if addressed, really helps young people feel calmer and make better decisions on the court. So I think performance anxiety is a place that I would recommend. The data proves out that a lot of coaches want this too. So the National Coach Survey data that we've looked at has found that somewhere in the neighborhood of 66 to 70% of coaches view performance anxiety specifically as an area that they want more training in and they need to get better at. There's a number of other areas that I think, certainly our field is moving towards, that we know coaches need to spend more time on. And certainly we've talked about building relationships, certainly motivation broadly in terms of how does motivation work? How many assumptions do we make about motivation? And so I think get trained in motivation, right? I think that folks who are particularly working in environments where they're worried about what's happening at home, I think that the work on trauma-informed coaching is really interesting now, really understanding how the brain and the body are manifesting trauma. I think that trauma doesn't have to be a bad word, but I think we need to understand it. And then I think mental health literacy broadly. Do I know what to look for when a young person is struggling and where to go if that happens? And I know that we tend to talk about basketball on this podcast, but we really need coaches to start thinking about these interpersonal dynamics that are a part of certainly performance, but also the experience of the kids on the team.
I feel like most coaches that I've been around, at least, that they feel that is a piece that they can improve and they can improve their understanding and knowledge. Because my view of it is that many of us come into this with a little bit of survivorship bias about the way we were coached or what we dealt with or what our society was like when we grew up. And it's just different and it just changes, and it's not good or bad. It's just different. Is that?
Yeah, I'll give you an interesting sort of example. I agree with you in this sort of notion that sort of we inherit the way we were coached and we expand that and we assume that because we got through it, everyone else will. But kids are changing. And I think that the growth, the changing ways in which kids communicate on social media is a piece. We know that from the survey findings that helping kids navigate social media is an area of real concern among coaches. They're saying that this is it's literally the number one least confident area of coaching from our survey data.
That surprised me when I saw that survey.
Yeah.
That was number
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
But I want to give you another piece to this, because I think when we start thinking about like training or support or growth as coaches, I really think that coaches need to be thinking a lot more deeply about the populations that they're working with and the gaps in understanding that they have. So one is, for example, young people with autism. I don't know if many folks have probably seen Last Chance U, and there's a scene in the second season where the head coach realizes that one of his players is autistic. And he had gone the whole season not knowing that his player had autism and not knowing that was actually part of the explanation of his behavior, which he assumed was that the kid didn't listen, that the kid was not paying attention, that the kid was lazy. But it completely changed his outlook. And I think that for coaches, really asking themselves, how well versed are you in things like ADHD? How well versed are you in certain kinds of common issues if you coach girls? How well versed are you in body image and issues related to food? I think menstruation and things of that nature, particularly if you're a male coaching females. I think there's a whole world of these kinds of things that coaches need to be more intentional about understanding.
That's such a great point. Being around my two daughters and coaching daughters, and my wife heavily involved in kind of research based and understanding kind of things around your cycles and just how different you are at different times. And those understanding those things, again, help drive better performance. And all of this is the goal.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is an honest reflection by coaches of how much of my coaching is shaped, obviously, by our technical, tactical, strategic piece. But ultimately, how does our season hinge and the experience of the players hinge on team culture, on relationships, and on the way in which we resolve conflict within players? And I think that piece, it's really on coaches and to a degree the people who support them to say, you know what, I'm going to continue to prioritize these. I am going to sacrifice a certain amount of time that I normally might spend running an inbounds play or preparing for a particular pattern in an opponent, and actually going to spend more time connecting with my athletes or addressing core issues in how we communicate and how we resolve conflict together.
Another question that I asked is, what kind of support would improve the experience for people who coach?
Yeah, I think this is a really big one that goes in a few different directions, and I'm glad you asked it. One is, so I think community is the low-hanging fruit to start with, right? So to what extent are the organizations who support coaches creating opportunities for coaches to come together and connect and feel supported with peers and by their organization? Easiest thing you can do, most taken for granted piece, hosting watch parties, bringing people together around food, creating end of season, early season social opportunities. I think it's really crucial because coaching, you're on an island, you can often feel alone. You need to connect with other coaches. I know that a lot of coaches engage in that. I think the next piece is more asking ourselves to what extent are organizations working, helping coaches with flexibility of practice and competition and season design. We know that particularly with women coaches or folks who are in a position where they have a lot going on at home, can we be flexible in practice scheduling? Can we be flexible in helping folks with childcare? Can we be flexible in the way in which in the responsibilities that we design for coaches? I know that, for example, co-coaching is an interesting conversation we've been having. Does every team have to have a head coach, or can we have multiple head coaches? Can we distribute the work in a more meaningful way? I think there's obviously certainly a conversation around benefits. And I think that the conversation that we've been trying to promote more and more is to what extent can we provide financial relief, reimbursements for common everyday coaching expenses that shouldn't come out of the pocket? Now, we've been advocating for this from a tax perspective. I think it's interesting to think about taxes in the context of saying, actually, many teachers can get education expenses for the classroom deducted from their taxes. What about coaches? Balls, your clipboards, your whistles, and any other things that you buy for your team. How about that? And then even mileage for travel. I think that's a piece that I found was really interesting because volunteers are eligible for a 16-cent per mile tax deduction, but people who run businesses are eligible for a 65% tax or mileage tax deduction. We should at least equate those. I know there's been some legislation out of Minnesota that's been interested in that. Let's not put the burden of travel on coaches' pocketbooks, right? Let's help them at least be able to get to games. And then I think the existential problem that we all talk about is pay. To what extent can we meaningfully compensate coaches for the work of coaching? And I think the work of coaching is something that we know it's a labor of love. Many of us do it because we want to do it. We maybe don't do it for the pay. Some cases pay is more symbolic than anything, but it matters. And it definitely matters to aspiring coaches who want to make a career out of that. I remember being a young 23-year-old who was getting started coaching, and it was like, I can't survive on this income, but I'm going to do it because I just want to coach. And there is a large proportion of coaches in this country who want to be career coaches, but they don't have insurance. They don't have compensation. They have to work multiple coaching jobs and a part-time job. This is my sort of dream vision. Can actually youth sports coaching in particular be an actual profession in this country?
I hope so. Because again, like if you talk to a lawyer, you talk to anyone else basically in any profession, doctor, etc., like they're not volunteering the time that we give.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole other conversation around this about how much we actually prioritize development of youth in general in
Yeah.
certain countries, right?
I think this gets to a really fundamental philosophical question that we have, and which is we've done some interesting surveying of parents. And if you look at some of the parent survey data that we've done, and Utah State's been a fantastic partner in that work, is parents of kids in sports identify coaches as the most important person in the development of their kids' lives. And we, as a culture, throw a lot of rhetoric. Like we say a lot of great things about coaches, right? Coaches do this and coaches do that, and coaches are so important. But it can sometimes ring hollow when we don't actually then follow through and actually provide the
There's
material.
no monetary value behind that.
That's right. And I think it's in part because sport has evolved as a primarily voluntary kind of role with the people who run. My dad ran a basketball league for 20 years, was never paid a dime. We had lots and lots of coaches in the community who just did it because they did. And those will always exist. And I'm not saying that every single coach of youth sports should be paid. But I think the people who meaningfully identify it, who engage in honest education and development, who are willing to stand by the standards of coaching in a really significant and honest way and invest in their own personal development, and who are good at it, really good at it, I think they deserve to be paid. And I think that's a really like a systems question that we need to really think about, because right now the only people who can be paid are really small nuggets of populations where there's just a lot of affluence and the families have the money to allow their clubs to pay for them.
To your point already that you've made, and I emphasize this to people that don't understand coaching, I'm saying, okay, you say volunteer, but really we're not even volunteers because we lose money coaching, right? It's a net negative type of experience generally where you're paying so much out of pocket. And
Yeah.
one thing that you're aspiring to in terms of that is let's just get to equal to start.
And I
And
will
that
say
would
that,
help, right?
yeah, and I will say that there are a number of entities who do meaningfully try to provide benefits. You look at a group like USA Gymnastics, they offer a ton of benefits to coaches, insurance being one of the main ones. And a lot of coaches associations also provide benefits to coaches. I think the challenge is that, and this is the nature of the way coaching operates in this country, is that we just are programs rich and systems poor. So we have lots and lots of people doing lots and lots of things, but they're not coordinated and organized and aligned for economies of scale in the way that we need. And I think that's something that is overdue for a conversation and focus moving forward.
Everyone that understands basketball in America and all the different systems involved is nodding
Right.
their head to that for sure. Like who's actually in charge and why can't we get some of these things orchestrated as a common system?
Well, no one's in charge. There's no one in charge. That's part of the
There,
thing. Like
you're
there,
you're saying it more directly. There's no one in charge of basketball in America, and that to me has always been a shocking thing because almost every other country, example, Basketball Canada, oversees all levels of basketball, including officials, et cetera, from that on down. And they're like all the rules, everything else is from the high schools to the clubs to everything, one entity.
yeah.
And that's common in most countries, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it is common to have more centralization than we have.
Yeah.
It isn't always the case that every single basketball coach in every country falls under one umbrella, but I think we know that in other places there is a more organized, supported entity who leads the work of supporting coaches in these countries. And those are tend to be quasi-governmental, so they get some support from government, but ultimately they are empowered to drive on education, they're empowered to drive on guidance, they're empowered to set standards, they're empowered to fund local entities. Yeah, obviously that's something that I think we would benefit from in some ways.
Look, coaches listening, I mean, we're an advocate for you. And that's a beautiful thing about these type of conversations is we're advocating for coaches. So we had that conversation around some of the different things that coaches would want more support in. So
Oh,
then it's a question of resources. So
yeah.
what resources would you prioritize to better support individuals as coaches? Let's choose one right now, Vince. What would be the one?
Look, I think that if there was one place that I would start personally, and this is maybe a little bit more of a personal answer, I think we need coach developers in this country. I think that coach developers as a profession, as a field, is something that is fundamentally underappreciated because we've never had it. But a coach developer is a person whose job is to provide on the job support, access to education, programming that helps coaches on the ground. Now, some coaches will be like, I don't need somebody in the back of my ear helping me. These coach developers are especially important for new and incoming coaches, which is part of our larger recruitment question and our supply of quality coaches question. Coach developers can play that really critical role. So imagine a person in a school or a person in a club whose job it is to do it could be even coach and athlete development. But if their job is coach development, then what they're doing fundamentally is they're hiring coaches, they're observing coaches, they're providing access to educational resources to coaches. In some cases, they're facilitating workshops themselves. They're certainly playing a larger role in supporting the new coaches who come in to make sure they have a good first experience. They're facilitating community among coaches. And then for coaches who are farther down the track, they're working with them to say, hey, where do you want to go next? And how can we help you get to where you're trying to go? What is it networking? Is it is a specific kind of coach you want to be, you want to shadow or observe? Can we help you do that? And I think a lot of coaches are on their own to do these things. And I think we would do more to actually create this infrastructure. And I think interestingly, personally, that's where I think those folks we could support. Those folks probably should be doing a little bit of higher education. They should be studying coaching and adult learning and adult development, a bit of sport management. To me, that is the place that I would really encourage our country to go around strengthening that. I think the other pace is probably subsidization for education. I think that we need to subsidize coach education. And I think we need to be really intentional about reducing barriers to access of quality knowledge. I know there's lots of folks doing amazing free stuff online. I know that you've put years and years of content online, but there's also really critical knowledge and information that coaches need to have that is expensive. And in some cases, that could be things like CPR education, that could be other less basketball specific stuff. I think reducing the cost of education for coaches, I think would go a really long way to improving the quality of coaching.
Or getting it covered, per se, as you said.
Certainly subsidized, get it covered, make it free. I think your early entry level core coaching needs to be as low cost as humanly possible.
Coach developer, just to connect this a little bit for the audience and have your thoughts on this.
Sure.
Often my relationship with some of the programs and the head coaches I work with is literally just that they have someone to talk to who is completely safe to talk to. It's nobody, I'm not their boss, I'm not their assistant, I'm just someone to talk to that they can throw stuff out. And sometimes it's just a question of saying, hey, listen, I did this and it didn't work. And I can validate them and say, hey, listen, in my opinion, you did the right thing. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. And it's providing perspectives to
Mhm.
people because I know in coaching, it's like this second guess profession that we're always thinking critically about what we could have done different or what we could have done better, but it's all in retrospect and helping them move to the present is so important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that part of one of the things we've learned from a research perspective about coach development versus coach education is that coach development is an ongoing process, whereas coach education is more of your kind of participation in a formal course or program. Yeah, sometimes there's some of this organic stuff built into these programs, but I think broadly what we're saying is a coach developer is a person who works with you over time to help you continue to grow as a coach. It's someone you trust. It's someone who has knowledge that you value, and it's someone who makes you feel safe to reflect, to be vulnerable about what you're struggling with. One of the things I really loved about the National Coach Survey is it helped us start to see what coaches were honestly struggling with. And a lot of coaches are struggling with how to coach people and how to work with attitudes and behaviors and motivations that they're in conflict with. And I think that's an honest place to be, but it's a lot of coaches don't have a place to go to express that. And I think that's where I think coach developers play a key role, either directly with the coach or creating spaces for coaches to do that with each other and encouraging that. And so I think this is where we know as another piece to this that coach developers are also important for extending the learning from the courses that you take. So they would be an individual who understands the content of the courses and says, actually, I'm going to help you implement this. So it's great I took that course or went to that clinic, but actually let's actually have a process for implementing it, and then we'll check in and see how it's going. And I think everyone would benefit from that kind of work. It's resource intensive, it's quite engaged, and you need to be skilled to be able to do it. But I think it's one of the most impactful things that I think we can do for improving.
No, I love that because most coach development, really, to be honest, that I've experienced is passive. And
Yeah.
we need to have active, where it's I get this information, I get to implement it, and then I get to have feedback or I get to ask questions or I get asked questions to be able to, again, interact with the material more actively so that I actually evolve.
I love webinars as much as anyone else. I love clinics and I love workshops, and I think those are great and are amazing, but they're not enough by themselves to get coaches to where we need to go. And I think if you're a coach listening to this and you don't have you may not be like, where the heck am I going to get a coach developer? Find a critical friend, right? Find a critical friend who you can be honest with, who you trust, who you can help each other out by being there for each other, right? If it's a weekly phone call, you need someone to bounce ideas off of. You need someone who can let you be open about what you're struggling with and who can give you thoughts and ideas. I think that's a really underappreciated part is this facilitated reflection that improves coaching.
Love it. Love it. Uh, what is one thing is that I ask the coaches this, what is one thing you would change about the way coach education happens in our country? I talked about your country. Let's
Mm,
talk just in generality. What's one thing that we can improve about coach education that is actually realistic? Like obviously more
sure, yeah.
money, but beyond the money, what's realistic?
I do think that the design of our courses needs to be as relevant to the learners as possible. And so by that, this is more of a question for the folks who are designing, for example, e-learning. I think there's a couple elements to this. One is that I think we have to be honest about the extent to which asynchronous online courses, what they're getting. And we've learned that a lot of online coursework can be valuable for things like gains in knowledge, shifts in attitudes and behaviors, feelings of confidence, particularly if it's a topic that you really don't have a ton of background in. However, we also know that a lot of these courses tend to try to be one size fits all. And I think there's a real challenge for the field of saying, actually, let's make sure that this is as relevant as possible to the person. So that could be something as simple as taking the course and making it, allowing it to be presented for that sport, right? Or adapted by sport. Same content, whether it's baseball, basketball, football, soccer, but actually it's by sport. The other thing I think is just saying, to what extent can our coach education include conversation and discussion? I think it's honestly the simplest
Yeah.
thing, but if you have a chance to talk with people about the content that you're learning, and that goes for things like workshops. So I think that as an example, a clinic coach comes on the court, they run a clinic and they're presenting their ideas. I would encourage, this is almost pedagogy 101, like create space for the coaches to talk about what you've just shared, right? Hey, talk to the person next to you for, I think this is the most underappreciated action to promote learning that I could ever advocate for. And we see it all the time. Give people a chance to reflect on what you've just presented and
I
then
love that last part. We've got to normalize that as part of the coaching clinic experience. I've been doing this for years, ever since I taught a coaching class, and I realized me talking for an hour, that's not engagement. And
that's right.
I think I researched, and it was called the pause recall method.
That's
That
right.
I would never talk longer than 20 minutes without pausing for 5 or 10 minutes and letting them interact with the material. And then
Mhm.
giving them some guidelines about how to interact, that agree, build, and challenge type of approach, or different approaches like that. Just it's simple, it's beautiful, and it turns it from passive to more active.
Yeah, and I think that this is now we're getting into the mechanics of coach education, which I love because I think now you're talking about simply good pedagogy, good education. One of the things we know about coaches who've been involved for, coaches are adults, they're more likely to be older. From an adult learning perspective, we need to be more cognizant of they have prior experiences that are going to shape the way in which they're interpreting what you're presenting. Give them a chance to make sense of what's happening, assimilate it into their knowledge or accommodate it, and then reflect on how they might do this with their team. And this kind of active learning is essential for recall, retention, and ultimately implementation. So I think that's the big sort of piece. Less content, more opportunity to discuss and reflect in a coaching session or coach education session.
I had it in my notes, so I want to come back to this and I want to get your
Yeah.
thoughts on this. The coach's least confident areas. You mentioned
Yes.
number one, which is helping athletes navigate social media.
Yes.
Number two, link athletes to mental health resources. Number three, refer athletes to support for unmet needs. Number four, identify off the field stressors. Number five, reduce performance anxiety.
Mhm.
All of those have a great synergy together, don't they?
Yeah, it's about the person, right? It's about the individual athlete you're coaching and helping them as people. And I think that those of us who have embraced a game-centered approach or really understand the importance of play have really what we're saying is that we care about the whole person. Let's take that farther. And let's say, actually, as a coach, I probably have a responsibility to really understand how to help people and help them as people, and not just in the way that I was helped when I was coaching. So a lot of coaches think that they're helping kids, and in some respects they probably are, by being tough on them, holding them to a high standard. But I think what we're seeing now is coaches need to adapt the way in which they help kids, and they're coming across challenges that are new, that are foreign, that they need to be honest about. So I think, again, young people are more and more conscious than they've ever been around being judged, around fitting in, around not being the right X or Y or Z. And so that's where anxiety is coming in. A lot more kids are lonely. A lot more kids have struggled to connect with peers. A lot more kids are struggling to find a sense of belonging. This is going to impact your team, but it's obviously impacting the kids. And if you really are a coach who cares about kids, you need to understand their needs and you need to take action to improve the way in which you help them deal with conflict.
I'm guessing that this list wouldn't be far off from what athletes would suggest as well. Are their least confident areas in sport? Is that
Mm.
somewhat fair to say?
Yeah,
That
that's
a
an
lot of them
interesting.
have trouble with stressors, a lot of them have trouble with confidence, a lot of them have trouble with navigating these relationships and the anxiety and social media and all the things around it. I'm just fascinated by that.
Yeah, you think about my coach doesn't like me,
Yeah.
or my teammates don't like me, or so and so is selfish,
Or
uh,
comparison of the social media piece is huge, right?
or
Some players
or
look so good on social media.
yeah, I think this is an interesting kind of dynamic, right? Of now moving into this space where we're saying, okay, like in order for me to be good, I need to be X. And I think this is an interesting, really important point, Chris, actually, because Increasingly sport, we're obviously very worried about dropout. We're very worried about kids dropping out of sport, of losing the love for the game. And if you think about kids who are like, why would kids leave sport? It's for a lot of these reasons. I'm not good enough. I can't do it. I'm being judged by my peers for how I play. I'm being filmed all the time and something might look bad. This isn't in my long-term future. Like it feels so much more high stakes now than it's ever been for young kids. And I think we can help them by saying, actually, hey, we're all right. Everything's going to be okay. I'm here to help you. A, B, do your best. C, just try to learn and grow and keep getting better. I think that you can still have a really quality team. You can have a really good team with that as the basis for your coaching philosophy. And I think we've seen that from high performance teams like the All Blacks and many other international elites that are saying, actually, we're focused on doing our personal best, controlling what we can control. That these are messages that are actually good for our well-being and also really good for performance.
Just as an aside, I try with the athletes I'm dealing with, under 12, under 11, under
Sure.
13, and especially my oldest daughter,
Yeah.
to get them to understand that you don't need to be the best version of yourself now. This is
Hmm.
about long-term development. And I think
Hmm.
that's one thing that has changed in our approach to coaching is so
Hmm.
much of it is about short term. And talking to parents, I think that's one of the things too, that they feel such a sense of FOMO if they're
Hmm.
not at a certain event or their daughter or son's not playing for a certain type of team or this, and discounting the fact that over time, that's what development is.
If you look at the International Center for Coaching Excellence, they're an amazing resource. I encourage people to have a look. They've got a important framework of the functions of a coach. And if you look at the functions of a coach, the first thing that they lay out is set the vision, which when you really unpack that, that means let's help athletes define success. What is success in our team this year? What is success for you as a player this year in this season? And I think that you're really getting into kind of like questions of like goal orientation, questions of motivational climate, because set the vision and is then followed by shape of the environment. So if we say, hey, look, we want to have fun this year, we want to get better as a team, we want to compete at our very best. And we don't want to be your last, I don't want to be your last coach. I think that like that actually as a basis versus we're going to win the championship this year. Look, hey, we all want to win a title this year. We all want to win conference. We all want to win the league. But let's set achievable, let's frame this experience in ways that meet them where they are, help them get better. But ultimately, I think to your point, like coaches need to understand how motivation works in order to be able to translate that into behaviors. And so you're going to use the language that you want. I just want you to come, Johnny, I just want you to come every day and give your absolute best and try to get better 1% tomorrow. That's all I'm asking of you. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to push you, but you can always listen to me. I think that coaches are have to be reflective about the way in which they're communicating to kids, but in ways that align to what we've learned about good motivation. And this is where I think training can help.
I love that. I love that. I constantly say it to the kids I coach is I cannot wait to watch you when you're 16. And just
Yeah.
framing it for them that you're going to keep developing and you can keep playing and keep having a great experience playing a game. And that's hopefully the goal.
But be clear, but sorry,
Go ahead.
Krista, be clear in what growth is. So we're not talking about just pure warm and fuzzies. Let's actually be very clear in what growth is. Hey, listen, like I really want to see you use your left hand more. I really want to see you take fewer contested shots and more catch and shoot threes. I really want to see you be able to apply pressure consistently on the ball. I'm going to push you, but do your best at it. And you're not going to get it right every single day, but I want to see you trying.
I love that. And connect it to fun. Don't connect it to achievement. To me, the biggest reason I share with all the players is you want to get more skilled at this, or you want to build your technique at this because you'll have more fun playing the game. If you only have one hand, you're not going to have as much fun if you can use both hands.
And this is where I do think that I've been really excited about the growth of the game towards more conceptual offense and more choice for players over how they play. Because when I have freedom, a degree of freedom and choice, number one, we're meeting my need for autonomy, which is part of self-determination theory. B, I think there's a creative freedom that's playful that kids love, and it's good basketball. It's obviously been the basis for a lot of this work, and I think it's best trained through games, which I think games are the basis for. If there's the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in sports, it's a game-centered approach, a game-centered approach because A, you're meeting physical activity. Kids are working really hard. They're moving their bodies. B, it's fun because you're playing the game. C, it's developing decision-making skills in the context of a situation that resembles and is representative of match play. And of course, if you design it well with good scoring systems, you're meeting all the kids' needs, you're meeting our team needs, and you're preparing them for competition well.
Love that. Love that. 80% of youth sports coaches agree that their community needs more coaches. Okay, so this is an extreme example I give sometimes to parents about officials. Like,
Yes.
who's going to want to officiate in 20 years?
Yeah.
Unless we go to something, and I'm saying an extreme, like a zero tolerance policy. You
Yeah.
cannot talk to an official
Yeah.
in a game. I understand that's an extreme that maybe not there, but I'm just saying, who wants to coach at some point if your organization or the different support structures allow certain things to happen while you're coaching and
Yeah.
you're just trying to do your best?
Yeah. So I think that we've done again this I think the survey data generated some really important insights around coaches and their stress and satisfaction. And while a lot of coaches really enjoy coaching and are willing to come back next year, they're at the same time the experience is often riddled with criticism from parents, feeling that their role is not valued. And but I think that the experience of coaching, which I think is something that we want to make sure is a good one, especially for entrance into coaching, first time coaches needs to communicate that this is a good experience. This is something I want to do again next year. That attracts more people next year. And I think we've run into an interesting problem, and some of it is not entirely like I don't want to put I don't want to blame parents for our recruitment problems. I think there are obviously we all know about situations where parents are a real challenge, and attitudes towards the coach really make coaches not want to do this. But I do think that we are in a place where we don't have the supply of coaches to meet the demand for them. And we, in particular, don't have the supply of quality coaches who understand good player development, who understand certainly the game, who understand kids and how to work with kids. And so we have a responsibility now as a community. It's not just the school's responsibility, it's not just the parents' responsibility. We collectively have a responsibility to make sport an environment where more people want to participate in it. And increasingly, the worry that we have is that sport is getting the bubble is shrinking. It's only for a certain kind of person, only a certain kind of player, only a certain kind of parent, only a certain kind of coach. And we're losing that sort of those folks in the middle who actually could be great. They're maybe not, they don't have amazing knowledge of the game or what have you, but they could grow into that. And many folks don't want to do that because the environment feels scary. It feels like they can't make mistakes. That's an important part of the conversation. I would encourage parents to be more intentional about how how they communicate with coaches and the effect it has on the coaching experience.
There's still a movement of coaches that do not understand how much coaching has changed in
Yeah.
30 years. And a lot of that comes back to data and research and the importance of that. So maybe can you help shape that for all of us to understand? And certainly analytics have changed basketball, for example.
Yeah.
But by and large, how we coach and how we teach hasn't changed for a lot of people, even though there's tons more data and tons more research.
I think this is a really important topic. And I would actually preface it by saying, maybe, Chris, you can ask your coaching audience what kind of data or research they would love to see, because we'd love to know that so we can work with it. I spent a lot of time talking to researchers, coaching researchers, youth development researchers, youth sports researchers. And, you know, one of the things that we know needs to improve in youth sports is a couple things. One is how much is data informing the way we coach people and the way we hire coaches and support coaches, right? So this is less about how does data inform my team coaching strategy on the court and more about how data informs the coaching environment and the world for coaches. I'll give you an example. What do we actually know about the behaviors, about coaching behaviors and how they impact players? So what do we know? What do we know about, for example, running for punishment? What do we know about yelling? What do we know? And I'm guessing that the researchers maybe who are listening to this would probably give us like, oh, we actually have done the study. I think that we can be way, way better at capturing data that connects coaching process behaviors to youth outcomes, right? And that could be on-court performance, and that can also be the experience of youth sport. So we'll piece there. The next piece is more of a bigger sort of organizational question around what data do we have and how do we actually think about why coaches continue to coach versus drop out? I think it's a really important question. And if we're not regularly observing and evaluating coaches, we're not regularly engaged in the process of collecting data on who our coaches are, their motivations, their attitudes. I think that we lack a degree of what we would call measurement muscle in the youth sports environment. Some of it is just a problem. We just don't have enough time. And I get it, totally understand it, but it's still a need. And then I think there's a bigger question for the US in particular, around how have we, to what extent are we both prioritizing research on coaches at the youth level in particular, but just coaches in general? And that's through funding, that's through the support of coaching as a field of research. I left the US for a reason, and it is because I felt that coaching as a field, as an academic discipline, was not strong enough here relative to New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Thought a lot about Canada. Canada is amazing. But I think that we can do a lot more to both invest in research and translate it to coaching. Here's my question to to most coaches, right? Like, how many of you have built your coaching philosophy on to what, actually, let me rephrase. Has research ever played a role in how you coach? Right. And Chris, you might say, yeah, absolutely. This is what I do. But there's a lot of coaches out there who are like, why would I ever think about research? And I think it's an interesting thing when you compare it to teaching, because teaching it has grown so much as a field that's informed by evidence-based practice. And I think that coaching needs to continue down that pathway. And you're doing great work in that way, which is why I love supporting what you're doing.
I appreciate that. But just throughout this episode, so many great questions for coaches to spend time with. Because again, we're all active participants in this. We're all coaching. We should all be invested in this process of trying to grow all these things we talked about. Because what helps another coach helps me too.
Yeah.
And that's really the way that I've always perceived all of this, is that if I'm helping someone else, it's probably helping me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
Vince, I can't thank you enough, man. Long overdue to have this conversation for everyone. Just beautiful. And we're going to have you back and have some other conversations around these spaces. And thank you so much for sharing with us.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation as always, and would love to support anyone who wants to go down these rabbit holes and talk about this stuff with me. So thanks for the opportunity.